China has spent the last 2 decades turning its infrastructure industry into a global force. From railways in Africa to highways in Southeast Asia, its companies now build and operate critical systems far beyond its borders. But ports are where this strategy goes even further. Today, China is involved in over 120 overseas ports. Some are operated under leases lasting up to 99 years. Others are built and run by Chinese state-owned firms. Together, these ports handle close to 30% of global container traffic, more than twice the volume processed by all U.S. ports combined. China trades more with the rest of the world than any other country on Earth, and nearly all of that trade, about 95% of it, moves by sea. That means ports are not just part of the supply chain. For China, they're a strategic necessity. These projects often fall under the Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure program launched in 2013. One major component of that plan is the Maritime Silk Road, a sea-based network of ports stretching from Southeast Asia to Europe and increasingly into Latin America and Africa. The idea is not just to move Chinese exports more efficiently, it's to shape the infrastructure of global trade itself, to create a web of ports that not only handle containers, but also give China a long-term foothold in strategic locations. Some of these ports are so large, so well-positioned, or so politically sensitive that they've started raising concerns in Washington, Brussels, New Delhi, and beyond. But before we get to the risks and debates, let's look at the facts, starting with the ports themselves. Here are 10 of the biggest and most important foreign megaports tied to China, ranked not just by size, but by strategic value, geographic importance, and how much control Chinese companies really have. Now let's head to Peru, where a Chinese-backed megaport is about to reshape trade on the Pacific coast. Just north of Lima, Peru, a massive deepwater port is rising from what used to be a quiet fishing town. This is Chankai, and it's not just another infrastructure project. It's China's biggest foothold in Latin America, and the country's first major port project on the Pacific side of the Americas. This $1.3 billion project is led by COSCO Shipping Ports, a Chinese state-owned company. COSCO owns 60% of the port, while Peru's Vulcan Compañía Minera holds the other 40%. But operational control sits with COSCO. Once completed, Chankai will have the capacity to handle some of the largest container ships in the world. It's being designed as a hub, not just for Peru, but for the entire region. There are already plans to connect it via rail and highway to central Brazil, creating a direct export route from South America to China. Chinese officials have described it as a gateway to South America, and President Xi Jinping personally praised the project at its virtual inauguration. So why does it matter? That's because it gives China a strategic port in a region traditionally dominated by the United States and right on the edge of the Pacific shipping lanes that link Asia and the Americas. U.S. officials have already voiced concern. In 2023, the head of U.S. Southern Command warned that Chankai could be used for dual purposes, including military or surveillance operations. China, for its part, says the port is purely commercial. But the debate is not going away, because the port is going online soon, and once it does, it could shift how trade flows through the entire Western Hemisphere. While Chankai looks toward Asia across the Pacific, another Chinese-backed port in West Africa is already up and running, and it's built to handle some of the biggest ships in the world. On the Atlantic coast of West Africa, just east of Lagos, sits Lekki Port, Nigeria's first deep-sea port, and one of the most advanced in the region. It officially opened in 2023, but the real story started long before that, when China Harbor Engineering Company partnered with the Nigerian government to finance, build, and operate the port. Today, the Chinese side, through a consortium that includes China Harbor Engineering Company and China Development Bank, owns 54% of the port and has a 15-year exclusive operating lease. That means Chinese firms run daily operations, control access, and collect a majority of the revenue. So why did Nigeria agree to those terms? That's because it needed a modern port badly. Lagos's existing facilities were overcrowded, shallow, and inefficient. Lekki, by contrast, is designed to handle 2.7 million containers annually, with berths deep enough for the world's largest cargo ships. It's also a cornerstone of a larger free trade zone, an industrial hub, which Chinese firms are also helping build. From China's perspective, this port is about access to raw materials, especially oil and minerals. From Nigeria's side, it's a chance to become a regional logistics powerhouse. But the implications go beyond economics. Lekki gives China a foothold in West Africa at a time when global powers are competing for influence across the continent, and with Chinese firms holding the keys not just to the port, but the surrounding infrastructure, that influence comes with long-term leverage. It's not just about containers, it's about presence. Now let's move northeast to the Persian Gulf, where China's presence in a key US ally's territory has raised quiet but serious questions. Right in the heart of the Persian Gulf, less than 80 kilometers from a major US naval base, sits Khalifa Port, one of the UAE's flagship infrastructure projects. And tucked inside it is something very specific, a massive container terminal run by a Chinese state-owned company. In 2018, COSCO Shipping Ports opened its $400 million dedicated terminal at Khalifa Port, its largest overseas investment at the time. The company was granted a 35-year concession by the Abu Dhabi Ports Authority to operate the terminal, which handles millions of tons of cargo bound for Asia, Africa, and Europe. So why here? That's because the UAE is perfectly positioned on the maritime routes connecting China to the Red Sea, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. It's a logical stop for China's maritime Silk Road and a hub for its trade with the Gulf region. But there's more to this story. When news of the COSCO terminal first emerged, it raised alarms in Washington. US officials worried the terminal, right down the coast from Al Dhafra Air Base, which hosts American and French forces, could be used for surveillance or intelligence collection. In 2021, the UAE quietly halted construction on a nearby Chinese facility after pressure from the US, but the COSCO terminal remains operational. China, as always, describes it as strictly commercial. And to be fair, it is one of the most automated and efficient container terminals in the region. Still, it shows how even in US allied territory, China has found space to operate and to plant another pin in its global logistics map. And this one sits in one of the most strategically sensitive shipping zones in the world. While the Gulf gives China access to Western trade routes, the next stop solves a different problem: how to bring Middle Eastern oil into China without passing through a narrow and heavily monitored choke point. On Myanmar's western coast, there's a port project that doesn't get much media attention, but matters a lot to Beijing. It's called Kyaukpyu, and it gives China something it's been trying to secure for decades: direct access to the Indian Ocean without going through the Strait of Malacca. Here's how. Kyaukpyu is being developed by CITIC Group, a major Chinese state-owned conglomerate. After local backlash over terms that gave CITIC an 85% stake, the deal was renegotiated to 70%, with Myanmar holding the remaining 30%. The port is part of a larger plan: connect it to oil and gas pipelines running directly into China's Yunnan province. Those pipelines are already built and operational. That means Chinese oil tankers can offload in Myanmar, and the oil gets pumped overland, cutting thousands of kilometers off the sea route and bypassing the Malacca Strait, one of the most vulnerable choke points in global shipping. For China, this reduces its dependence on a single maritime corridor and adds redundancy to its energy security. It also strengthens China's position in the Bay of Bengal, a region long seen as India's backyard. But the project has not been smooth. Local communities have raised concerns over land seizures, environmental risks, and lack of transparency. The port was also scaled back, from an originally proposed $7.3 billion mega project to a phased build-out, partly due to fears of over-indebtedness. Still, construction is underway and is expected to open by late 2025. And if it's completed, Kyaukpyu could become one of the most strategic links in China's global port network, not because of size, but because of where it sits. It's a small harbor with a very large role. That same need for reliable access to the Indian Ocean shows up again further south, in East Africa, where China is backing not just one, but two key ports in Kenya. On Africa's eastern coast, Kenya is home to two major ports that have become key parts of China's ambitions in the region, Mombasa and Lamu. Let's start with Mombasa, the busiest port in East Africa. In 2010, China helped finance the expansion of Mombasa's second container terminal, using loans from the Export-Import Bank of China. Construction was handled by Chinese firms, and the port now handles over 30 million tons of cargo a year. But that investment came with debt. Kenya still owes billions to China, not just for the port, but for the rail line that connects it inland. There were even reports that China could seize the port if Kenya defaulted. Officials denied that, but it added fuel to the debt trap debate. Then there's Lamu Port, about 300 kilometers north. This one's newer, built almost entirely by China Communications Construction Company as part of the Lapset Corridor, a plan to link Kenya with Ethiopia and South Sudan. The idea is to create a new logistics gateway, reducing reliance on Mombasa and turning Lamu into a hub for trade and oil exports. The first berth opened in 2021. Eventually, the port could have up to 32 berths, making it one of the largest on the continent. And just like other Chinese-backed ports, it's tied to plans for industrial zones, highways, and pipelines, all connecting back to Chinese trade routes. From Beijing's perspective, Kenya is a critical piece of its maritime Silk Road, a stable partner, strong economy, and direct access to the Indian Ocean. From Kenya's side, the ports offer promise, but also long-term financial risk. 2 harbors, billions in loans, and one growing question: what happens when the infrastructure outpaces the trade? But not every project goes as planned. Just across the Indian Ocean, there's a port that became the global poster child for what critics call China's most aggressive port deal yet. Just a few nautical miles south of one of the busiest shipping lanes in the Indian Ocean sits Hambantota Port, a $1.5 billion harbor that's become a global talking point for all the wrong reasons. Built with Chinese loans and constructed by Chinese firms, Hambantota was supposed to turn Sri Lanka into a major maritime player, but the port opened in 2010 to almost no traffic. It lost money year after year, and by 2017, Sri Lanka was deep in debt and looking for a way out. That's when China Merchants Port Holdings stepped in. In exchange for $1.12 billion in cash, which the Sri Lankan government used to shore up its foreign reserves, the Chinese company took a 70% stake in the port and secured a 99-year lease. It was one of the longest and most controversial handovers of strategic infrastructure in recent history. Critics called it a textbook example of debt trap diplomacy. Beijing denied that, but either way, Sri Lanka had lost operational control of a major port, one it could no longer afford to manage on its own. Since then, traffic at Hambantota has picked up slightly, and China has promised hundreds of millions more in investment to develop a free trade zone and industrial park around the site. Still, the port remains mostly underused. What it represents, though, is far more important. To some, it's a warning of what happens when countries take on too much debt for prestige projects. To others, it's a strategic puzzle, because Hambantota is close enough to India to raise red flags and deep enough to someday host military vessels if China ever wanted to test the limits of the lease. Beijing insists it has no interest in that, but it doesn't have to. It already has a 99-year contract and a firm foothold on the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, another port is offering China something Hambantota couldn't: a direct overland trade route straight into Western China. On Pakistan's southwestern edge, just a few hundred kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz, sits Gwadar Port, a place that didn't even have a proper dock 2 decades ago. Today, it's the centerpiece of CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and one of the most strategically important ports in China's entire global network. Here's why. Gwadar offers direct access to the Arabian Sea, and by extension, the Middle East. It gives China a shorter overland route for importing oil and gas, bypassing the Malacca Strait entirely. From Gwadar, Chinese goods and fuel can travel north into Xinjiang through newly built highways and pipelines, reducing reliance on longer sea routes. But this is not just about trade routes. In 2015, Pakistan granted China a 40-year lease to operate Gwadar Port. The company in charge, China Overseas Port Holding Company, doesn't just run the port, it keeps 91% of the revenue. Pakistan takes the remaining 9%. That kind of deal raised eyebrows. Critics inside Pakistan questioned whether their country had given away too much control. but the government defended it, pointing to promised investments, including a 2,200-acre free trade zone, expressways, and energy plants funded by Chinese banks. For China, the investment makes sense. It's about security, logistics, and geopolitics, all wrapped into one location. For Pakistan, it's about infrastructure, development, and deepening a long-standing strategic relationship. There's also speculation, though officially denied, that Gwadar could one day serve Chinese naval vessels. That has not happened, but it wouldn't take much to shift from commercial traffic to military logistics. The port is already deep enough, and China is already in charge. And that's why Gwadar is more than just a port. It's a test case for how trade, influence, and security can all move through the same harbor. But this strategy is not limited to developing nations. In fact, one of China's most visible wins is in the heart of the European Union. On the Aegean Sea, just outside Athens, lies Piraeus, one of Europe's oldest ports and now one of its busiest. And it's run by COSCO, the Chinese state-owned shipping giant. In the aftermath of Greece's debt crisis, the country began selling off state assets. In 2016, COSCO bought a 51% stake in the Piraeus Port Authority. 5 years later, it increased that stake to 67%, making it the majority owner. That gave China control over Europe's 7th largest port and direct access to the EU's internal market. Under COSCO's management, Piraeus has been transformed. Container traffic has more than tripled, cruise ship services have expanded, and the port has become a key transshipment hub for Chinese goods entering Europe. The Greek government welcomed the investment. Jobs were created, port revenues increased, and Greece became a major node in the maritime Silk Road. But not everyone was comfortable with it. European officials began to worry that critical infrastructure, including ports, telecom, and energy, was falling under foreign state control. After the Piraeus deal, the EU passed stricter foreign investment screening laws. Labor unions in Greece also pushed back, accusing COSCO of undermining working conditions and sidelining local operators. Still, the deal stood, and China used it to anchor deeper logistics routes, funding rail connections from Piraeus into the Balkans, Hungary, and Central Europe, shortening delivery times for goods entering the continent. For Beijing, Piraeus is a success story, a fully functional, high-volume port in a Western democracy integrated into global supply chains. For Europe, it's a case study in what happens when long-term economic stress meets short-term investment offers, because once the port is sold, the ship has already sailed. And China didn't stop at just one port. It quietly extended its reach deeper into Europe by taking stakes in key terminals across Belgium and Spain. While Piraeus gave China a southern gateway into Europe, ports like Zeebrugge in Belgium and Valencia in Spain have helped it move even further inland, into the logistical heart of the continent. Let's start with Zeebrugge. In 2018, COSCO Shipping Ports acquired a majority stake, 85%, in the Zeebrugge container terminal. That gave China operational control over one of the largest cargo facilities on the North Sea, just a short sail from major hubs like Rotterdam and Hamburg. From here, Chinese goods can reach Germany, France, and the UK within hours by road or rail. But China was not just looking north. In Valencia, Spain's largest port by container volume, COSCO took over stakes in several terminals through a Spanish logistics firm it had already acquired. The result? Chinese companies now control key sections of both ports, giving them visibility and influence over a growing share of Europe's maritime supply chain. It's not just about owning terminals, it's about shaping where the ships dock, who gets priority, and how cargo flows through Europe's inland networks. And unlike the Piraeus deal, these investments didn't spark the same level of public controversy. The stakes were smaller, the deals were framed as commercial partnerships, and the ports were already diversified. But for analysts watching closely, the pattern was clear. China was expanding its presence not through dramatic takeovers, but through steady, layered investments, terminal by terminal, stake by stake. And over time, those investments add up. In the case of Zeebrugge and Valencia, they've added up to a Chinese presence inside the logistical bloodstream of Western Europe, far from the headlines, but right where it counts. Still, no other port shows how far China is willing to go, combining commercial investment with a permanent military presence, quite like the one at the entrance to the Red Sea. Just outside the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, sits Dorale Port in Djibouti. It's small compared to some of the other ports on this list, but in terms of strategic value, it might be the most important one China has. Here's why. Dorale was built and expanded with Chinese financing. It's now operated by a Chinese company and forms part of a larger logistics and industrial hub, one that China helped construct from the ground up. But what sets it apart is what's next door. In 2017, just a few months after the commercial port was upgraded, China opened its first overseas military base, also in Djibouti. It was not labeled as a base. Officially, it was called a logistics support facility, but it includes a pier large enough for warships, troop housing, helicopter pads, and underground bunkers. And it sits just a few miles from Camp Lemonnier, a major US military base that supports operations across the Horn of Africa and the Middle East. This is the only place in the world where American and Chinese military bases operate within driving distance of each other. The port and base together give China a permanent presence at one of the busiest and most strategic choke points in global trade. Roughly 10% of global shipping passes through this stretch of water on its way to or from the Suez Canal. For Beijing, the base supports anti-piracy patrols and peacekeeping missions. For Washington and its allies, it's a foothold that could easily evolve into something more, especially as China's naval capabilities expand. China didn't just build a port in Djibouti, it built a model, one that starts with infrastructure and ends with influence. And that's what connects every port on this list. Some are commercial, some are strategic, but all of them are long-term. Because when you control how goods move, you control more than just trade. You shape the terms of access, the flow of resources, and eventually, the balance of power. Some countries are now pushing back, others are doubling down. Either way, the global map of port ownership looks very different than it did 20 years ago. And China's role in that shift is impossible to ignore. So the question is, how much control is too much? And is China simply building a more efficient trade network to support its economy? Or is it laying the foundation for something larger? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you soon in the next video.